The padlock did not want to open. Nora had been waiting 40 years for it to. Her hands shook, but not from the cold. She turned the little brass key twice before the hasp gave. 42 years married. 40 of them with that door locked. She had left a thermos of coffee on that step more mornings than she could count. She never once tried the knob. Not yours to carry, Walter always said. Not yours. Now Walter was in the ground. The key was hers. Her whole body was telling her to walk back to the house and let Ellis handle it. She did not walk back to the house. Inside, the air smelled like sawdust and cold motor oil. Something older sat underneath, like a drawer nobody had opened since Reagan was president. A single bulb hung on a cord. She pulled the string. Yellow light fell across a workbench. A pegboard of tools. A coffee can of nails gone orange with rust. Nothing that looked worth a nickel. Ellis would say that. Ellis had already said it 3 days ago, standing in this exact doorway with his arms crossed. That shed's not worth the dumpster to haul it off, Mum. And you know it. She had said nothing then. She said nothing now. She just knelt down, slow, the way 71-year-old knees make you go. She pressed her palm flat against the floor beneath the workbench. One board gave a little, just a little, enough. But before the floorboard, there was the funeral. 11 weeks earlier, Nora Calloway Pruitt stood in her own kitchen in Piney Fork, West Virginia. She was holding a green bean casserole nobody had touched. Her son and his wife were discussing square footage. 4 bedrooms if you count the loft, Dawn was saying, phone out, scrolling something. The workshop's not going to add value, but the lot line goes all the way to the rail spur. That's worth something to somebody. Somebody like who? Nora said. She did not mean to say it out loud. Dawn looked up, surprised like the casserole dish had spoken. Just talking numbers, Mum. It's what people do. Ellis Pruitt was 45 years old. He had his father's jaw and none of his father's patience. He set a business card down on the kitchen counter, face up, so she could read the name. A realtor 2 towns over. We're going to want to move on this within 30 days, he said. The market's good right now. No sense letting the house sit empty, eating property tax. Your father's been dead 4 days, Nora said. I know how many days it's been. Ellis did not raise his voice. He never did. That was the thing about Ellis. He could say the coldest thing in the calmest voice. He could somehow make it sound like arithmetic. I'm trying to be practical, Mum. Somebody has to be. Piney Fork was the kind of town where everybody at the funeral had known Walter Pruitt by name. Half of them had known him by the sound of his truck on Hollow Creek Road before they ever saw it. The church had been full. The casseroles kept coming for 3 days after, like the whole county had agreed, without a meeting, that this is what you do when a good man dies. Nora had eaten almost none of it. She had spent those 3 days answering the same question in 6 different voices. I'm fine, thank you. We're managing. Every night she had walked out to the workshop door. She'd set down a full thermos of coffee, like she had for 40 years. She'd gone back inside without touching the lock. Old habits do not know their own reason has died. The reception after the funeral was in the church basement. Folding tables covered in checked cloth. The smell of coffee and casserole dishes, and someone's aftershave, too strong for a room this size. Ellis and Dawn had a corner to themselves. Nora's daughter, Faye, lived 4 hours away in Charleston. She had come for 2 days, then gone back to her own children, apologetic and exhausted. Nora did not blame her for that, not for 1 second. It was Ellis who stayed. It was Ellis who, on the 3rd night, sat across from her at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. He started listing what needed doing. House goes on the market, he said. Savings account splits 3 ways once probate clears. That's you, me and Faye, per Dad's will. The truck will sell unless you wanted to keep it, but I don't see why you'd need a truck that size. He looked up. And the workshop, which is, Mum, be honest, a shed full of dead tools. Nobody's going to pay extra for that. If anything, it's a liability, structurally. That roof's not right. Your father built that roof 40 years ago. Ellis said it gently enough that it almost did not sound cruel. Almost. I'm not trying to be hard about this. I'm trying to get you through it without a mess. You don't need to be dealing with a workshop nobody can use. Nora looked at her hands on the table. 60 years of dishwater and garden dirt. 60 years of careful, patient stitching. For children who were now taller than her and further away than she liked. She thought about the thermos she had set on that step that very morning, out of habit, before she caught herself. There was no reason for it anymore. She thought about the words her husband had said to her, more times than she could count across 42 years, whenever she asked what he kept in there. Not yours to carry. Someday. Not today. He had said it kindly, every time. It still landed like a locked door, every single time. I want the workshop, she said now to Ellis across the yellow legal pad. Ellis blinked. Mom, there's nothing in there. Then it costs you nothing to let me have it. He studied her for a second. The way a man studies a woman he has decided, without meaning to, requires managing. Then he shrugged. He wrote something on the legal pad. Fine. You get the shed and the truck. Faye and I split the house proceeds and the account. That work? It did not work. It was not close to fair, not in dollars, and everyone at that table knew it, including Nora, who had raised this man, fed this man, sat up nights with this man's fevers. Now she watched him divide up his father's whole life like a man measuring lumber. But she said yes. She said yes because there was a stubbornness in her that had outlasted better women than Ellis had ever met, and because some quiet, unexamined part of her had already decided she was going to open that door. 3 days later, at the reading of the will, the lawyer read out the accounts. His name was Porter, a tired, decent man. The house. The truck. And one line about the workshop and its contents, granted outright and without condition to Nora Calloway Pruitt. Ellis had not objected. To him it was nothing. A generous nothing even, since it made him seem reasonable at no real cost. He had no idea what he had just signed away. Nora did not know it either. Not yet. She walked home from the lawyer's office past the Hartshill lumber sign. Dark 15 years now. Past the church. Past the diner where she and Walter had eaten a slice of pie every Sunday for 4 decades. Somewhere on that walk she felt something in her chest. It was not grief exactly. It was older than grief. It was curiosity, the kind she had swallowed for 40 years because a good wife did not pry. A good marriage did not need prying. Walter had never once given her a reason to think he was keeping anything from her that would hurt her to find. She believed that. She had always believed that. She just did not know yet how right she was, or how wrong she'd been about what not yours to carry really meant. The morning she finally turned the key was a Tuesday, 3 days after the will reading, cold enough that her breath showed. She had waited until Ellis and Dawn drove back to their own house, 40 minutes east, until the neighbours were at work, until the only sound on Hollow Creek Road was the wind moving through the dead cornfield behind the rail spur. She had thought, walking down there, that she would find exactly what everyone told her she'd find. Dead tools. A leaking roof. 40 years of a man's private hobby, nothing more. Instead she found a floorboard that gave under her palm. Beneath it, when she pried it up with a screwdriver from the pegboard, sat a rusted ammunition box. Army green, gone the colour of an old bruise. Latched shut. She sat back on her heels on the cold concrete. She looked at it a long moment before she touched the latch. Walter Pruitt had never served a day in the military. He had worked at the Hartshill mill from 19 until the mill folded in 1991. Then carpentry and small engine repair out of this very shed for 30 years. Quiet, steady, unremarkable work. It had put 2 children through school. It never once made the local paper. Nora had married a man everyone in Piney Fork agreed was solid. Solid was the word people used. Not exciting, not showy. Solid, like a foundation. Like something you built a house on top of and never had to think about again. She had thought for 42 years that she knew everything solid there was to know about him. The latch gave with a small metallic shriek. Inside, wrapped in a sheet of oilcloth gone stiff with age, sat 3 cloth-bound ledger books, black covers, red spines, pages lined for numbers. Beneath the ledgers, a small tin, the kind that had once held pipe tobacco. A strip of yellowed tape sealed the lid. Nora lifted the top ledger out first, opened it. The handwriting was Walter's, small and careful. The same hand that had written her grocery lists and birthday cards for 4 decades. The first entry was dated March 1984. $150. CB cash. Paid in full for the month. She turned the page. Another entry, the next month. Same amount, same 2 initials. She kept turning, month after month, year after year. The same small payment, in the same careful hand. Sometimes cash, sometimes a money order. The amounts climbed slowly. $150 became $200, then $300. The initials never changed. CB. She did not know who CB was. She had never heard those initials in her married life. Not once. Not at church, not at a barbecue, not whispered in an argument. Yet here they were, recorded with more discipline than Walter had ever shown, balancing their own household checkbook. 40 years of payments to somebody whose name Nora Pruitt had never been told. Her hands were shaking again. This time it had nothing to do with the cold. She was still kneeling there, ledger open on her lap, when she heard gravel crunch outside. A truck door closed. She looked up to see Wendell Hobbs in the workshop doorway, a folding table saw balanced on one shoulder, exactly the way she'd asked him to bring it 3 days ago, before any of this began, back when she thought she only needed help moving furniture out of a dead man's shed. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Nora," Wendell said. "Maybe I have," she said, and held the ledger up so he could see the page. Wendell Hobbs was 74 years old. He had worked the same shift as Walter at Hartzell Lumber for 11 years, before the mill closed. He had known Walter Pruitt longer than Nora had. He set the table saw down slow. He crouched beside her, the particular care of a man whose knees no longer trusted the ground. He took the ledger from her hands. He read the first page, then the second, then flipped ahead 10 years, then 20. His face changed. Not dramatically. Wendell Hobbs was not a dramatic man. But something behind his eyes went very still, the way a face goes still when a man recognizes a debt he had hoped was buried. "CB," he said, quiet. "You know who that is?" Wendell did not answer right away. He set the ledger down on the workbench, careful, like it might crumble. He looked at the ammunition box, then at Nora. Something in his jaw told her whatever came next was going to cost him something to say. "Curtis Boyd," he said finally. "You remember the name?" Nora tried to place it and could not. "Should I?" 1983, Wendell said. "Before your time here, maybe. Before you and Walter married, wasn't it? Spring of 84 when you two wed?" "March," Nora said. "We married in March of 84. Wendell nodded slowly. He pointed at the ledger's first entry. "March 1984. $150. CB cash. The month you married him," Wendell said, "is the same month he started this." He told her the rest of it there in the workshop. He sat on an overturned bucket, because his knees would not let him kneel any longer. Nora stood with her back against the workbench. She listened to a story about her own husband she had never once heard him tell. In November of 1983, Wendell said there had been an accident at the Hartzell mill. A saw guard should have been replaced 2 years earlier. It finally failed. A young man named Curtis Boyd, 22 years old, working the same shift line as Walter, lost his life to it. Walter had been the shift foreman on duty that night. Not the one operating the machine. Not the one who'd failed to file the maintenance request, 3 separate times though he had tried. But the foreman, the man whose name was on the safety log, the man who, in the county's eyes and his own, had been responsible for the flaw that night. There was an inquest, Wendell said. Mill's insurance settled quiet with the Boyd family, paid what they had to, and not a dollar more. The county filed it away, and everybody in this town agreed real fast to stop talking about it. Walter never got charged with anything. Wasn't his machine, wasn't his signature on the maintenance log that got ignored, but he was the man standing closest to it when it happened. I don't believe he ever once let himself off for that. Not once, in 40 years. "He never told me," Nora said. "Would you have wanted him to?" Wendell asked, not unkindly. A man carries something like that. Sometimes the kindest thing he thinks he can do is carry it alone. Nora looked down at the ledger again. $150 a month, 1984. She did the arithmetic without trying to, the way you do when a number has just become personal. 41 years if the payments truly ran that long. Even at the lowest figure, before the amount climbed, that was tens of thousands of dollars. Quietly moved out of a household budget she had helped keep for 4 decades, to a family whose name she had never once heard spoken at her own dinner table. "Not yours to carry," she said out loud, mostly to herself. Wendell looked at her, not understanding. "That's what he always told me," Nora said, "whenever I asked what was in the shed." 40 years, Wendell. He said it like it was some kind of tenderness, like he was protecting me from something. Maybe he was. Maybe, Nora said. Or maybe he just didn't trust me to carry it with him. She said it plain without heat. But it sat in her chest like a stone all the same. 42 years of marriage. And there had been a corner of her husband's guilt she had never been allowed near. A family whose grief he had quietly funded every month of every year they were married. She did not know yet whether that made him a better man or a lonelier one, or both. She turned to the second ledger. Same hand, same initials, same steady climb of numbers. On a page near the back, tucked into the binding, a single scrap of paper. Not part of the book at all, a torn corner of something older, with 3 words in Walter's smaller, younger handwriting. Count to every page. She looked up at Wendell. He used to say something like that to me, word for word almost. When I'm gone, count every page before you believe what anybody tells you it's worth. Sounds like your husband, Wendell said. Never one for extra words. But he never wasted one either. They sat there a while longer, the two of them, in the cold light of that single bulb. Outside, the wind kept moving through the dead cornfield. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Nora thought about Ellis, 40 minutes east right now. Probably already on the phone with the realtor. Probably already imagining the numbers on a listing sheet for a house and a lot he believed held nothing of value, past the square footage. She thought about the word he'd used. Worthless. That's not worth the dumpster to haul it off, Mum. And you know it. She looked down at the second ledger. 40 years of a dead man's discipline, recorded in careful pencil. A debt nobody had made him pay, and he had paid anyway, every single month without once asking for credit or forgiveness, or even his own wife's understanding. He knew exactly what it was worth, she said quietly. That's why he locked the door. Wendell reached over and picked up the small tobacco tin, still sealed at the lid with old yellowed tape. He turned it over once in his big, careful hands. He held it out to her. You can open that too, he said, or you want me to. Nora took the tin from him. She peeled back the tape, slow. The way you peel back anything that has kept a secret, longer than you have been alive, to ask it questions. Inside, taped to the underside of the lid, sat a small brass key, the kind that fits a lockbox, not a house. Beneath it, folded flat, a single strip of paper, with an address in Walter's careful hand. Piney Fork Farmers Bank, Box 114. There's more, Nora said. There's always more, Wendell said, with a man who counted this careful. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Nora closed her hand around the little brass key. For the first time since she'd walked into that workshop, she felt something underneath the grief and the shock. Something she had not expected to feel at all. Something almost like anger. Not at Walter, not exactly. At the 40 years of a locked door she had respected out of love. Maybe, just maybe, some part of it had also been about a man who had decided, all on his own, without ever asking her, that she could not be trusted with the weight of what he carried. She was still holding the key when she heard, faint on the wind, a car turning onto Hollow Creek Road, coming from the direction Ellis always came from. Whatever this workshop held, she thought, she was going to need every ounce of quiet she had left. Her son was on his way to tell her, again, what he thought it was worth. It would not be the last time. The car was not Ellis's, it was Sheila Voss, the county clerk, driving her own sedan out on her lunch hour. Nora had called her that morning before any of this, to ask an old, half-forgotten question about the Hartsell Mill records from the year she'd married Walter. Sheila had said she'd swing by after her shift, since the courthouse files on anything that old took some digging. Digging in person was easier than a phone call. She had not expected to find Nora sitting on an overturned bucket in a workshop, an open ammunition box between her and Wendell Hobbs. You look like you found something, Sheila said, standing in the doorway. We found 40 years of something, Wendell said. Sheila Voss was younger than both of them by 2 decades, sharp-eyed. The kind of clerk who had learned early that the county's paper told the truth, even when the county's people did not want it to. She listened to the short version, the ledgers, the initials, Curtis Boyd's name. Her face did the same thing Wendell's had. Going still in the particular way a face goes still, when old, deliberately buried history surfaces without warning. I can pull the file, she said. 1983 inquest. If it's on record, it'll be on record. Give me till end of week. Take your time, Nora said, though something in her voice suggested she did not entirely mean it. Sheila looked at the ledgers a moment longer, then at Nora. Something kind and careful passed over her face. For what it's worth, Mrs. Pruitt. My father worked line at Hartsell too. Different shift. He always said Walter Pruitt was the only foreman who ever actually walked the floor himself instead of signing off from the office. That's a nice thing to hear, Nora said. I don't know if it's the whole truth, but it's a nice thing to hear. Sometimes that's the same thing, Sheila said, and left with a promise to call by Friday. That night, alone in the house she had shared with Walter for 42 years, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the 3 ledgers stacked in front of her. She did not eat dinner. She had brought them inside wrapped in a dish towel, as if they were something that could spoil. She had not yet told a single person outside that workshop what she had found. Not Faye, not Ellis, not even the pastor, who had called twice that week to check on her, the way pastors do. She opened the 3rd ledger, the one she had not yet finished. The entries continued nearly to the present. The last one, dated only 6 weeks before Walter's stroke. The amount now $300. The initials the same. The handwriting a little more unsteady than 1984, but still unmistakably his. 41 years, nearly every month. She did the arithmetic slowly with the same pencil she used for the church collection ledger, carrying the ones the way her grandmother had taught her, refusing to trust it to a calculator until she had checked it twice by hand. When she finished, she sat looking at the number for a long time. $190,400. She thought of Ellis standing in the workshop doorway 3 days after the funeral, arms crossed, telling her the shed wasn't worth the dumpster to haul it off. No, she thought about the $200 in scrap he had estimated. Generously, she was sure he thought, when he'd floated the idea of just clearing it out himself to save her the trouble. $190,000. Moved quietly out of a household she had helped balance every week of her married life, to a family she had never met, for a debt that was never legally Walter's to pay. She was not angry at the money. That surprised her sitting there. She had half expected to feel robbed, the way a woman might feel discovering her husband had kept a secret account from her for decades. But it did not feel like theft. It felt, the longer she sat with it, like something closer to devotion, just aimed somewhere she had never been allowed to see. What she felt instead, underneath the grief, underneath even the anger at the locked door, was something that surprised her more. Pride. She had married a solid man. She had believed for 42 years that solid meant unremarkable. Tonight she understood, for the first time, that solid had meant something else entirely. It had meant a man who carried a weight nobody made him carry, for 4 decades, without once asking to be forgiven, or praised, or even seen. She closed the ledger. She set her palm flat on its cover, the way she had set her palm flat on the workshop floorboard that morning. She thought, not for the first time that week, that she still had a great deal to learn about the man she had buried 11 weeks ago. Some of it, she suspected, was not going to be easy to sit with. The phone rang at 8 that evening. "Ellis, Mom, I talked to the realtor," he said without preamble. "She wants to walk the property Thursday. I know it's soon, but the market's not going to wait for us to grieve on our own schedule, and I don't want the house sitting through winter with nobody in it." "I'm not ready for that, Ellis." "Nobody's ever ready," he said, gentler now. The way he got gentle right before he pushed. "But Mom, be practical. What are you going to do with a 4-bedroom house and a workshop full of junk? You're 71. You don't need the upkeep." "Faye and I have been talking. And honestly, a smaller place near one of us would make more sense anyway. I'll think about Thursday," Nora said, and hung up before he could say anything else. That was not something she had done to her son in 45 years of being his mother. She sat holding the phone afterward, her heart going harder than it should for a woman her age. "Not yours to carry," Walter had said, for 40 years, about a shed full of ledgers. Maybe not, Nora thought, but it's mine now, and I intend to carry it exactly as far as I choose. She did not sleep well that night. She kept thinking about Curtis Boyd, 22 years old, dead before she'd ever moved to Piney Fork, a name she had never once heard her husband speak. She thought about a family somewhere, maybe still in this county, maybe scattered to the wind by now. A family that had received a plain envelope every month for 41 years, from a man who never once signed his name to it. She thought about the small brass key sitting now in the tobacco tin on her nightstand, the address written in Walter's careful hand, Piney Fork Farmers Bank, Box 114. Whatever waited in that box, she understood now, was not going to be the end of this story. It was only the next page. Walter had told her, in his own careful hand, tucked into a book he had locked away from her for 40 years, to count every single one. She meant to. Piney Fork Farmers Bank sat on Main Street, between the diner and a hardware store that had sold Walter half his tools over the years. A squat brick building, a flag out front that had needed replacing since spring. Nora had banked there her whole married life. She knew the tellers by name. She knew which one gave extra peppermints at Christmas. She knew the manager, a soft-spoken man named Curtis Amble, well enough to ask after his mother's hip surgery. She had never once been told there was a box in her husband's name. Box 114, she told him, laying the small brass key on the counter between them. I found this in his workshop. Curtis Amble looked at the key, then at the ledger card he'd pulled. Something crossed his face that Nora was getting used to seeing this week. Recognition. Careful recognition. The kind a man wears when he knows more than he's about to say outright. Your husband opened this box in 1985, he said. Renewed it every year since. Paid in cash. Never missed a renewal. He came in alone, always on a Tuesday, always around lunch. He paused. I only remember because my father managed this branch before me. He used to say Walter Pruitt was the most punctual man he ever did business with. Did my name go on this box? Ever? No, ma'am. Just his. Sole access. Curtis Amble looked almost apologetic saying it, as if he could feel this fact was going to cost her something to hear. But the will named you as successor. It's yours now, free and clear. I just need you to sign here. She signed. Her hand was steadier than she expected. The box, when they carried it back to a small private room off the lobby and opened it together, held less than she thought it would, and more than she was ready for. A folded document, brittle at the creases. It turned out to be the original 1983 accident report from the Hartsell Mill, county seal still visible in the corner. A second document, a settlement letter from the mill's insurance carrier, dated early 1984. The amount blacked out by whoever had filed it, but the family's name printed clear across the top. Boyd. Beneath both documents, a plain white envelope, unsealed with 2 words written on the front, in Walter's hand. For Edie. Curtis Amble excused himself quietly, the way a decent man excuses himself from a room that has just become too personal for a banker to stand in. He left Nora alone with the envelope. She had never once, in 42 years, heard Walter call her Edie. It was not her name. Not on any document, not on any form. Edith was her mother's name. Dead now 30 years. A woman Walter had loved the way a son-in-law loves a mother-in-law, who never once made him feel unworthy of her daughter. Nora sat very still for a long moment, turning that over, before she understood. He hadn't misnamed her. He'd folded 2 women into one word. The way a man does sometimes when grief and love get tangled up in his chest and he can't tell anymore which one he's writing to. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. The handwriting shakier than the ledgers, written more recently, she guessed. Maybe even in the last year of his life. Nora, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found the box, and I imagine you're angry with me right now, and you have every right to be. I never told you about Curtis Boyd, because I didn't know how to say it without making you carry a night that wasn't yours to carry. It happened 7 months before we married. I signed off on that floor. I didn't cause the accident, but I was the last man whose name was on the log before it happened, and no court in this county was ever going to charge me. And I never once let myself believe that meant I was clean. So I paid what I could, every month for as long as I was able, because Curtis Boyd's mother buried her son at 22, and I got to grow old with you, and that never once felt like something I earned. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd look at me different. Maybe you will anyway, now. If you do, I understand. But Nora, I need you to know something else, and it's the real reason I kept that door locked all these years. It was never about hiding the guilt from you. It was about making sure that if anything ever happened to me, you would have something set aside that Ellis and Faye couldn't touch, couldn't argue about, couldn't split 3 ways at a kitchen table. Look under the last page of the 3rd ledger. Count careful the way I taught you. I love you. I always did, even the parts of me you never got to meet. Nora read it twice, then a 3rd time. Her hands not shaking now. Gone very still instead. The particular stillness of a body absorbing something too large to process standing up. She thought about Ellis's kitchen table, the yellow legal pad, 45 years of a son dividing his father's whole life into 3 neat columns: house, truck, savings. She thought about the word he'd used for the workshop, liability. She folded the letter back into its envelope. She gathered the two documents. She thanked Curtis Amble on her way out with more composure than she felt, and drove straight home to pull the third ledger's last page, free of its binding. Under it, taped flat against the inside back cover, where she would never have thought to look without Walter's letter telling her to, sat a single folded document. From a title company 2 counties over, dated 11 years ago. It described a half-acre parcel along the rail spur behind their own property, purchased outright, in cash, in the name of Nora Calloway Pruitt alone. She had never once heard of this parcel. She had lived behind it. She had walked past its fence line more mornings than she could count on her way to the mailbox. She never knew that 11 years ago her husband had quietly bought it and put her name, and only her name, on the deed. She sat down hard on the kitchen chair. She did not get up for a long while. The following Tuesday, Ellis called again. This time the realtor was already scheduled to walk the property that Thursday, whether Nora had agreed to it or not. He delivered that fact with the particular calm confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. It's just a walk-through, Mum. Nothing binding. But we need an appraisal before we can even talk numbers with Faye, and the sooner we get that started, the sooner probate can close, and everybody can move forward. Move forward, Nora repeated. You know what I mean? I don't think I do, Ellis. Her voice was calm, calmer than she expected it to come out. Your father's been dead less than 3 months, and you've had a realtor's card on my kitchen counter since the day of his funeral. There was a pause on the line, the first genuine pause Nora could remember from her son in this entire ordeal. I'm trying to take care of things so you don't have to, he said finally. It might even have been true in the narrow way Ellis understood the phrase. I don't know why you're fighting me on this. I'm not fighting you, Nora said. I'm telling you the walkthrough can happen. But the workshop isn't part of it. That's mine, remember. You said so yourself at your father's table. 3 days after we buried him. Another pause. Then, careful, testing. Is there something in there, Mum? There's 40 years of your father, Nora said, which is more than you ever bothered to ask about while he was alive to tell you. She hung up before he could answer. The second time in a week, she had done that to a son who was not used to being hung up on. She called Wendell that evening. She told him about the letter, the parcel deed, Edie. Wendell listened without interrupting. A habit Nora had come in the space of one strange week, to depend on more than she expected to. He never told me any of that either, Wendell said when she finished. Not the parcel. I knew about the payments, some of it, because I helped him mail a few envelopes back when his knee was bad one winter and he couldn't drive to the post office himself. I never asked what was in them. Wasn't my business to ask. You carried an envelope for him and never once opened it. Wasn't mine to open, Wendell said simply. The way a man says a thing he has never once doubted in his life. Man asks you to mail something, you mail it. That's the whole of it. Nora thought about that for a moment, about the particular kind of loyalty that asks no questions. How rare that kind of quiet had become, in a world where her own son couldn't wait 3 days past a funeral to start dividing assets. There's something else, Wendell said after a moment. 1998. You said the handwriting breaks off in that ledger for about half a year, then picks back up in a different hand before it goes back to Walter's. Nora hadn't told him that. She'd only glanced at it herself briefly, before setting the ledgers aside to deal with the bank box. But Wendell had apparently gone back through the pages himself, the day they found the box, memorizing what he saw, the way a careful man memorizes anything that might matter later. I noticed it too, she said. I didn't know what to make of it. 98 was the year Walter had his first heart attack, Wendell said, quiet. 6 months in Ronceverte General. Most of it. Then home recovering another 3. He wasn't driving anywhere, wasn't mailing anything. I remember because I was the one who drove him to half his appointments. Then who kept the payments going that year? Wendell didn't answer right away. Something in the silence told Nora the answer before he said it. The particular quality of a man working up to a confession he'd carried a long time. I did, he said finally. I didn't know the whole of it back then. Walter told me from his hospital bed. There was an envelope that needed mailing the first of every month to an address in Charleston, and it mattered more than near anything, and would I see to it while he was laid up? I didn't ask why. I just did it. 6 months. Then he was well enough to take it back himself, and neither one of us ever spoke of it again. You knew about Curtis Boyd, Nora said. It wasn't quite a question. I put it together, eventually, Wendell admitted. Not right away. But a man doesn't ask you to mail $600 to a family in Charleston without you starting to wonder why. And I'd been on shift that night in '83, same as Walter, just a different line. I knew what happened to Curtis Boyd. I just never said his name to Walter. Not once. In 40 years. Some things a friend just carries alongside you. Quiet and doesn't make you talk about. Nora sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window, at the workshop roof, just visible over the fence line. Thinking about two men, one of them dead now, who had shared a debt neither of them ever spoke aloud, for 4 decades, out of nothing but loyalty and shame and something that might have been love, if men like Walter and Wendell had ever allowed themselves the word. Thank you, she said finally, for carrying it when he couldn't. Wasn't mine to be thanked for, Wendell said. Was just doing what a friend does. She hung up not long after. She sat at the kitchen table with the third ledger open in front of her, tracing her finger down the gap where Walter's hand disappeared and Wendell's took over. 6 careful months in a slightly different slant. Then Walter's own hand returned, a little shakier than before, but present, unbroken, all the way to the last entry. 6 weeks before his stroke. 41 years. 2 men. 1 debt neither of them had ever been legally required to pay. Thursday came anyway. The realtor arrived promptly at 10, in a car too clean for Hollow Creek Road. Ellis met her at the end of the driveway, with the easy confidence of a man who had already, in his own mind, sold the house twice over. Nora stood on the porch and watched them walk the yard, watched the realtor gesture at the roofline, watched Ellis point toward the workshop and say something Nora couldn't hear from that distance, though she could guess well enough at the shape of it. She did not go down to meet them. She had already told Ellis plainly that the workshop was not part of any walkthrough. She intended to see whether her son had learned, in 45 years, to respect a boundary his mother set without a legal document forcing him to. He had not. She watched him walk the realtor within 20 feet of the workshop door. Nora came down off the porch, unhurried, and stood between them and the padlock, arms folded the way she had seen Ellis fold his own, more times than she could count. That's not part of today, she said. Mom, she just needs to see the lot line. She can see the lot line from where she's standing, Nora said. The door stays shut. The realtor, to her credit, had the sense to step back without argument, murmuring something about coming back another time. Ellis stood there a long moment, colour rising in his face, the particular colour of a man unaccustomed to being told no by the person he'd spent a lifetime assuming would always say yes eventually. You're being difficult, he said, once the realtor was out of earshot. I'm being clear, Nora said. There's a difference, and your father spent 40 years teaching me it, even if it took me this long to learn. Ellis looked at her for a long moment. Something worked behind his eyes that might have been the first real flicker of doubt Nora had seen from him since the funeral. Then he shook his head, the way a man shakes off a thought he doesn't want to finish having, and walked back to his car without another word. Nora stood in the driveway until his taillights disappeared around the bend. Then she walked back to the workshop, unlocked the padlock, and sat down on the overturned bucket Wendell had left there. The ledgers stacked on the workbench beside the small tin. The deed to the rail spur parcel folded in her coat pocket, where she'd carried it every day since finding it. She was starting, for the first time in 11 weeks, to feel less like a widow standing in the wreckage of a life she hadn't chosen. More like a woman finally being handed the truth of the life she had chosen 42 years ago, without ever quite knowing the whole of what she'd signed up for. It was, she thought, sitting there in the cold yellow light, a strange kind of gift. Not the money, not even the land. The gift was this, proof in her dead husband's own careful hand that the man she had married had been exactly as solid as everyone always said, and twice as brave as anyone, including her, had ever given him credit for. She only wished he had trusted her enough to let her carry some of that weight, while he was still alive to set it down beside her. A man she did not recognise came to the door 2 mornings later, midweek, driving a truck with a magnetic sign on the door that read, Dunmore Land Development. A smile Nora distrusted before he'd said 10 words. Mrs. Pruitt. Name's Cody Dunmore. I run a small development outfit out of Beckley, and I understand there's a parcel back behind your property that might be coming loose from the estate. I'd love to make you an offer, before the county gets involved and complicates things with easements and hearings. Cash, quick close, save you the headache. Nora stood in her own doorway and studied him a moment, something in the surname landing before she could place exactly why. Dunmore, she said. Any relation to a Roy Dunmore? Used to manage the floor at Hartsell Lumber. The younger man's easy smile flickered. Just slightly. Just long enough for Nora to notice. That's my grandfather. Retired a long time back. I'm surprised you'd know the name. I know a great many names I didn't know 2 weeks ago, Nora said. I'll tell you what I told my son, Mr. Dunmore. That parcel isn't for sale. And it isn't loose from anything. It's mine, clear title, has been for 11 years, and I'd ask you not to come back out here with another offer, cash or otherwise. No harm intended, ma'am. Just business. He handed her a card anyway, the way salesmen do even after being told no. Then he drove off in a spray of gravel. It struck Nora as a little more aggressive than the moment called for. She sat with the card in her hand a long while after he left, turning the name over. Dunmore. The same name signed on a 30-year-old safety log, acknowledging 3 ignored maintenance requests. 8 days before a young man died on the mill floor, she did not believe the grandson knew the first thing about that history. Cody Dunmore looked like a man who had built his whole career reading county zoning maps, not old inquest files. But it unsettled her, all the same. The idea that the family whose negligence had shaped 41 years of her husband's quiet penance might now be circling the very land that penance had, without either of their knowing, secured. She called Wendell that evening and told him about the visit. Wendell went quiet on the line for a moment before he spoke. That family's been buying up half the old mill corridor for 10 years now, he said. Roy Dunmore never did an honest day's accounting in his life. Not that I ever saw, and it wouldn't surprise me if his grandson's cut from close to the same cloth, dressed up nicer. You watch yourself with that one, Nora. Don't sign anything. Don't let him rush you. And call me if he comes back. I don't intend to sign anything, Nora said. But it does make me want to move a little faster than I'd planned. Get the county's project confirmed and the title settled clean before anybody with a magnetic sign on his truck decides my parcel's worth pressuring an old widow over. Smart, Wendell said. Your husband would say the same. Man never once let anybody rush him into a decision he hadn't already made on his own time. Cody Dunmore came back once more a week later, this time with a slightly higher number and a slightly less patient tone. He stood in the driveway explaining, at some length, the risks of county easement negotiations and how a private cash sale now would spare her all of that uncertainty. Nora listened to the whole pitch without interrupting, the way she had learned to listen to Ellis these past weeks. Then she declined again, just as plainly as before. This time she watched him leave without the easy smile. Replaced by something thinner and more irritated, it told her more than any word he'd said exactly how much he'd hoped she would fold. She did not fold. She had spent 42 years married to a man who never once folded under pressure he considered unearned. Standing in her own driveway, watching a developer's truck disappear down Hollow Creek Road, she found that some of that same stubbornness had apparently been living quietly in her the whole time too, waiting for its own turn to be needed. She mentioned the visits to Sheila the next time they spoke, half expecting to be told there was nothing official to be done about a pushy salesman. She was surprised instead to learn that Sheila made a note of the name Dunmore in her own file, quietly. The careful habit of a clerk who had learned that a name worth watching once was usually worth watching twice. Sheila Voss called Friday morning exactly when she'd promised. She asked Nora to come by the courthouse if she had the time. Nora had the time. She had, it seemed, nothing but time now. A whole life suddenly rearranged around a shed she'd been forbidden to enter, and a debt she hadn't known existed a week ago. The Randolph County courthouse smelled like every courthouse Nora had ever set foot in. Floor wax and old paper, a heating system that ran too hot in the file room. Sheila met her at the records counter with a manila folder already pulled and waiting, thicker than Nora expected. Found the inquest file, Sheila said. Took some digging this old. It's on microfiche. Not digital, but it's all here. County ruled it an accident. Mill's fault for deferred maintenance on the guard. No criminal negligence assigned to any individual employee. Curtis Boyd, 22, survived by his mother, Odessa Boyd, and one younger sister. No father listed. Is the family still in the county? Mother passed in 2009. Sheila said gently. But I found a current address for the sister. Charleston. Regina Boyd. Now Regina Boyd Tillman. Married, 2 kids, works at a hospital there. I only found it because your husband's payments were still going to a Charleston address as of his last entry. County records cross-reference easier than you'd think, once you know what you're looking for. Nora sat with that for a moment. The name suddenly a real person, instead of 2 initials in a ledger. Regina, a little sister who would have been, 16, 17, when her brother died. A woman in her 50s now, somewhere in Charleston, who had spent 4 decades receiving an envelope every month from a man she had probably never once met in person. Does she know who's been sending it? Nora asked. All these years? I don't know, Sheila admitted. That's not something county records would tell me. But I can tell you the settlement the mill paid the family in 1984 was small. Insurance minimum for the time. Barely covered burial costs and a fraction of what a wrongful death claim would run today. If your husband's payments really ran 41 years, at the numbers you described, they'd have dwarfed that settlement inside the first decade. Nora looked at the inquest report again, the flat bureaucratic language of it. Deferred maintenance, guard failure, no individual culpability assigned. She thought about how thin that paper was compared to the weight her husband had apparently carried every day of their marriage. There's one more thing, Sheila said, and something in her voice made Nora look up. I pulled the original safety log too, since it's part of the inquest file. Your husband did file 3 separate maintenance requests on that guard in the 6 weeks before the accident. All 3 date-stamped. All 3 went to the plant manager at the time, a man named Roy Dunmore. Dunmore's signature is on the file acknowledging receipt of the 3rd request, dated 8 days before Curtis Boyd died. Nothing was ever done about it. So it wasn't his fault, Nora said, quiet. Not really, not even a little. Legally, no, Sheila said. But I've read enough of these files to know that doesn't always settle the part of a man that isn't legal. Sounds like it never settled it for your husband. Nora thanked her. She took a photocopy of the inquest file for her own records. She drove home with the radio off, the whole 40 minutes, turning over what she now understood. Walter had done everything right. He had filed the requests. He had followed procedure. A negligent plant manager named Roy Dunmore, a man Nora had never heard of and would likely never meet, had let 3 warnings sit on a desk until a 22-year-old boy died because of it. Walter, blameless by every legal measure the county could produce, had spent 41 years quietly paying for a sin that was never his, because he had been the last name on the log before it happened. Some men carry that kind of proximity, like a verdict no court ever needed to hand down. She thought about Ellis, who could not sit with an uncomfortable feeling for 3 days past his own father's funeral, before he needed to convert it into a listing agreement. She thought about how different the 2 men were, father and son. She had spent 45 years hoping, the way mothers do, that some of one would rub off on the other. It hadn't. Not yet, anyway. She was not ready to give up on that hope entirely. At home, she found Dawn's car in the driveway. That surprised her, since Dawn rarely came without Ellis and almost never came alone. Nora found her daughter-in-law standing at the edge of the yard, looking toward the fence line and the rail spur beyond it, phone in hand. I wasn't snooping, Dawn said quickly, when Nora approached. I was just... The surveyor called Ellis back about the lot line, and he mentioned there's a parcel back here that doesn't show up clean on the old plat map. I told him I'd drive by and take a look while I was out this way. There's no reason for a surveyor to be involved yet, Nora said. Nothing's for sale. Ellis wants to be ready to move fast once probate clears, Dawn said. She had the decency, at least, to look a little uncomfortable saying it. He's not trying to steamroll you, Nora. He just processes grief by doing things. You know that about him. I've known that about him for 45 years, Nora said. Doesn't make it easier to stand in front of. Dawn was quiet a moment, looking at the fence line again. Then, unexpectedly, softer than Nora had heard her sound in years. For what it's worth, I think he knows he's pushing too hard. He just doesn't know how to stop once he's started. His dad was the only person who could ever really slow him down and, well... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Nora studied her daughter-in-law for a moment, surprised by the small crack of honesty. She decided for the first time in a long while to offer one back. There's a parcel back there, she said, nodding toward the fence line. It's mine. Has been for 11 years. Walter bought it and put my name on the deed and never told me. Dawn's eyebrows went up. Why would he do that without telling you? I'm still working that out, Nora said honestly. But I'd ask that you not mention it to Ellis just yet. Not until I've had the chance to understand it myself. Dawn looked at her for a long moment, some calculation moving behind her eyes that Nora couldn't fully read. Then she nodded, slow. Okay, she said. I won't say anything. A pause. Nora, is there something valuable back there? Is that why the surveyor found an irregularity? I don't know yet, Nora said, which was almost true, and left it at that. Dawn left not long after. Nora stood in the yard a long while, watching the spot where her daughter-in-law's car had disappeared down Hollow Creek Road, wondering how long the promise not to mention it would actually hold, deciding it did not much matter either way. Whatever was coming, she intended to be the one who decided when and how it arrived. That evening she called Regina Boyd Tillman. She had debated it for 2 days, turning the decision over. The way she turned over the ledger's arithmetic, slow and careful, checking it twice before trusting the result. In the end, she decided a woman deserved to know something. Those envelopes, hers now or her late mother's before her, had come from a real man with a real name. He was gone now. Whatever guilt had driven him to send them had never once been matched by an obligation to keep sending them. He'd sent them anyway. 41 years of anyway. Regina answered on the 4th ring, a warm, tired voice. The voice of a woman who worked long hospital shifts and answered unknown numbers cautiously. My name is Nora Pruitt, Nora said. I believe you may have known my late husband Walter, though maybe not by name. I think he's been sending your family an envelope every month for a very long time. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Nora wondered if the call had dropped. Walter Pruitt, Regina said finally. Very quiet. I always wondered. My mother knew the name. She never told me, not until she was dying, and even then she only said it once, like she was scared to say it twice. She said there was a foreman who never stopped paying, even after the mill said they didn't have to, even after the lawyers told us the case was closed. She used to say he was the only decent thing that ever came out of the worst year of her life. He never told me either, Nora said. I found out 3 weeks ago, going through his things. Is he? Regina started, then stopped. Nora understood the question before she finished it. He passed. 11 weeks ago. A stroke. Regina was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice had thickened. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Pruitt. That man paid for my brother's life every month since before I could walk, and I never once got to thank him for it, because I never even knew his name until my mother whispered it to me on her deathbed, like it was something shameful to say out loud. It wasn't shameful, Nora said. I've been trying to understand it myself. I don't think it was ever about the money. Not really. I think it was the only way he knew how to say he was sorry. For 41 years, without ever once expecting to be forgiven for something that wasn't even legally his fault. Then he was a better man than most, Regina said. I'd like to meet you sometime, Mrs. Pruitt, if that's something you'd want. I'd like that very much, Nora said, and meant it. They talked another 20 minutes. Two women who had never met, bound together across 4 decades by a debt one husband had paid and one wife had only just learned existed. By the time Nora hung up the phone, her face was wet. She had not noticed the tears arrive. She sat at the kitchen table a long while afterward, the ledger stacked in front of her, the deed folded in her coat pocket, where it had lived for a week now. She thought about how strange it was, the shape grief took when it finally started making room for something like pride. Sunday at church, 3 older women from the sewing circle stopped Nora in the parking lot the way they always did, gentle and a little too curious, asking after her the way small towns ask after their widows, half kindness, half appetite for news. You holding up all right out there alone, Nora? Asked Doris Sims, who had sat behind Nora in the same pew for 20 years and buried her own husband a decade before. Better than I expected, Nora said honestly. Turns out there was a great deal about Walter I didn't know. I'm still working through what to make of it. That man, Doris said, shaking her head fondly. He fixed my porch steps free of charge back in '09 and wouldn't take so much as a pie for it. Said the county should have fixed them years before, and he was just correcting an oversight. I always thought that was a strange way to put it, correcting an oversight, like he was balancing some ledger only he could see. Nora felt something settle in her chest at that. Small and warm. Another piece of the same quiet man, fitting into place from a direction she hadn't expected. "That does sound like him," she said. "He was the only decent one of the bunch, some of us always said," added Marlene Foss, the third woman, lowering her voice the way people do when they are about to say something they've held back out of politeness for years. "Not that Ellis is a bad boy, but he came up in a different world than his father did, one where everything gets priced before it gets understood. Walter wasn't like that. Walter understood things a long time before he ever thought to ask what they were worth." "I'm only now understanding how true that is," Nora said. The three women patted her arm in turn, the particular wordless comfort of women who had outlived enough husbands between them to know exactly how much comfort a widow could stand to receive at one time. They let her go without pressing further. She drove home, turning Doris's phrase over in her mind, correcting an oversight. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of thing Walter would say about a debt he considered morally owed rather than legally required, phrasing it plain and small so nobody would ever think to ask what oversight, precisely, or whose. Ellis called again 2 days later. This time his voice had an edge to it she hadn't heard before, sharper than his usual calm arithmetic. "Mum," the surveyor got back to the realtor. "There's a discrepancy on the lot line, a half-acre parcel behind the house that's not part of the estate. It's titled separately. Do you know anything about that?" Nora had known this call was coming, from the moment Dawn's car pulled out of the driveway 2 days before. She had decided, sitting with the ledgers that same night, exactly how she intended to answer it when it came. "I know everything about it," she said. "It's mine. Your father bought it 11 years ago and put it in my name. Why would he do that?" Ellis's voice had gone tight, the particular tightness of a man doing quick math in his head and not liking the answer. "That doesn't make any sense, Mum, unless there's something about that land, or unless—" He stopped himself. "Unless what, Ellis?" "Nothing," he said too fast. "I just don't understand why Dad would hide a parcel from all of us for 11 years. "He didn't hide it from all of you," Nora said. "He hid it from you specifically. He gave it to me." The silence on the line this time was long enough that Nora almost thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its usual composure, replaced by something raw, something almost like the boy she remembered, before he'd learned to talk about his own father's death, in terms of square footage and market timing. "What else don't I know?" he said quietly. "A great deal, as it turns out," Nora said. "More than I have the patience to explain over the phone. Come to the house Sunday. Bring Faye if she'll drive down. I think it's time the three of us sat at that kitchen table together, the way your father used to insist we do whenever something mattered." "Is this about the workshop?" "It's about your father," Nora said. "The workshop is just where I found him." She hung up gently this time, no anger in it. She sat for a long while afterward, looking at the 3 ledgers stacked on her kitchen table, at the letter addressed to Edie, folded back into its envelope, at the deed to a half-acre of riverside land that had been quietly hers for over a decade, without her ever knowing it. Sunday was 5 days away. She intended to use every one of them to decide exactly how she was going to tell her children the truth about the man who had raised them. A truth large enough, she suspected, to change the shape of every argument they'd had since the funeral. And maybe, if she was lucky, the shape of a few arguments that had been building between them long before that. Faye drove down from Charleston Thursday night, instead of waiting for Sunday. Nora had not expected that. She was grateful for it all the same. Her daughter arrived a little after 9, tired from the drive. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, while Nora laid out slowly and in order everything she had found. The ledgers, the letter, the parcel deed, the phone call with Regina Boyd Tillman. Faye listened without interrupting. The way she had listened to things her whole life, quieter than her brother, quicker to feel, and slower to speak. When Nora finished, Faye sat for a long moment, turning her teacup in small circles on the table. "I always thought Dad was just, I don't know, private," she said finally. "Not secretive. Private. There's a difference, but I never thought about how big the difference could get until right now." "I've been thinking the same thing all week," Nora said. "Does Ellis know yet? About all of it? He knows about the parcel. Burn me. He doesn't know about Curtis Boyd, or the ledgers, or the letter. I want to tell you both together. Sunday, the way your father always insisted we handle anything that mattered." Faye nodded slowly, then looked up, something careful in her expression. "Mom, can I ask you something? And I want you to know I'm not asking it the way Ellis would ask it." "Ask it? Is there a lot of money in this? Is that why Ellis is so, I don't know, wound up about the surveyor and the lot line?" Nora considered the question. She decided her daughter deserved the honest shape of the answer, even before Sunday. "Yes," she said, "more than any of us imagined when your father was alive." "I don't want it to become the whole of this story, Faye. I don't think that's what your father intended when he built it. But yes, there's a great deal of money and a great deal more land than any of us knew existed." "Ellis is going to lose his mind," Faye said, not unkindly, more like a woman naming a weather pattern she'd lived under her whole life. "He's going to want to know why Dad didn't tell him. He's going to make it about being left out." "I imagine he will," Nora said. "I'd like you to help me make sure Sunday isn't only about that. Your father spent 41 years quietly making something right that nobody made him make right. I don't want that story to get swallowed up in an argument about who deserved to know first." Faye reached across the table and took her mother's hand, the way she used to as a girl, when Nora tucked her in at night. For a moment neither of them said anything at all. "He was a good man," Faye said finally. "He was," Nora agreed. "I think I only understood how good this past week. I spent 42 years thinking I knew the whole of him, and it turns out I only knew the parts he let me see. I'm still deciding how I feel about that." "How do you feel about it?" Nora thought about the question honestly before she answered it. "Proud," she said. "Underneath everything else, underneath being a little hurt that he didn't trust me with it while he was alive, I keep landing on proud. He carried something for 41 years that would have broken a lesser man, and he never once let it turn him bitter or cruel or absent from us. He showed up every day. He built us a life, and he was doing this too the whole time without a single complaint." "That sounds like Dad," Faye said. For the first time since the funeral, mother and daughter let themselves cry a little. Together, at the kitchen table, over a man neither of them had fully understood until a week after they'd buried him. Friday, Nora drove into town and stopped by the workshop one more time before Sunday. Alone, wanting to sit with it a while longer before she had to explain it to Ellis. She unlocked the padlock, pulled the string on the bulb, and sat down on Wendell's bucket, looking around at the pegboard, the coffee can of nails, the workbench where 3 ledgers and a small tin had waited 40 years for someone to finally lift the right floorboard. She noticed this time things she hadn't noticed the first day, too shocked then to see past the ammunition box. A calendar on the wall, still turned to the month Walter died, with small check marks along certain Tuesdays going back years. Marks she now understood meant a trip to the bank, or the post office, or both. A coffee mug on the shelf, hers, chipped at the handle, one she'd assumed lost years ago, sitting exactly where he must have kept it. For the mornings he wanted her coffee close at hand, if only in memory, while he worked. A drawing folded small and tucked behind a jar of screws. A child's crayon rendering of a house, signed in careful block letters. Ellis, age 7. Walter had apparently kept it in this shed for nearly 40 years, without either of his children ever knowing it existed. She sat with that drawing a long while. Whatever coldness had grown in Ellis over the years, whatever hardness his father's death seemed to have hardened further, Walter had kept this close. His 7-year-old's crayon house, within reach, every day he worked in this shed. That felt important somehow, sitting there. It felt like something Ellis needed to see. More than he needed to see the ledgers, though she suspected he would need to see both before Sunday was through. She was still sitting there when Wendell's truck pulled up the drive. Unannounced but not unwelcome, the way his visits had become over the past 2 weeks. "Figured you might want company before Sunday," he said, settling onto an overturned crate across from her. "I do," Nora admitted. "I keep rehearsing what I'm going to say to them, and every version sounds either too soft or too hard." "Might not need to rehearse it," Wendell said. "Might just need to open the ledger and let Walter say it himself. Man was never much for speeches while he was alive. Doesn't seem right to put speeches in his mouth now that he's gone." Nora considered that. She found she liked it better than anything she'd rehearsed all week. "You're a wise man, Wendell Hobbs." "I'm an old man who's watched a lot of families come apart, over money that didn't even belong to anybody yet," Wendell said. "Difference between wisdom and mileage isn't always as big as people think. They sat a while longer, comfortable in the quiet, The way two people can be when they've spent enough recent days in each other's company that silence stops needing to be filled. Eventually, Wendell cleared his throat, a little awkward. The particular awkwardness of a careful man about to say something that mattered to him. "I want you to know," he said, "whatever happens Sunday, whatever your children decide to make of all this, you've got a friend in this county who isn't going anywhere. Walter was my friend 40 years. I'd be proud to be yours the same length if you'll have me." "I'd like that very much, Wendell," Nora said, and meant every word of it. Saturday, Sheila Voss called one more time. A final piece of information, uncovered digging through the county's old zoning files. The half-acre parcel along the rail spur, the one Walter had quietly bought and deeded to Nora 11 years ago, sat directly in a corridor the county had been studying. A planned river walk, small commercial redevelopment. A project discussed in county council meetings on and off for the past 3 years. Now, as of a vote 2 months ago, finally moving toward approval. If the county needs that parcel for the project, Sheila said, and preliminary maps suggest they will, they'll have to negotiate a purchase or an easement with whoever holds clear title. That's you, Mrs. Pruitt, free and clear. No liens, recorded 11 years ago, in your name alone. Nora sat with the phone against her ear, looking out at the fence line, understanding for the first time the full shape of what her husband had built, without ever once mentioning it across a decade of dinners and anniversaries and ordinary Tuesday evenings. He had not simply paid off an old debt. He had also quietly, patiently, without a single word to anyone, secured his wife's future, long after he'd be around to secure it for her himself. Tucked inside the very act of his atonement, as though the two things had never needed to be separate at all. "Thank you, Sheila," Nora said, "for all of it. I don't think I could have found half of this on my own." "You'd have found it eventually," Sheila said. "Your husband left a trail a careful woman could follow. He just made sure it only opened for somebody willing to count every page." Saturday evening, Pastor Emmett Cray stopped by the house, the way he had every week or two since the funeral. He carried a foil-covered dish his wife had sent. He carried something else too, the particular gentle patience of a man who had buried enough of Piney Fork's husbands and wives. He knew grief moved at its own pace. It needed no supervision. He found Nora at the kitchen table, the ledgers still spread out from the afternoon. She surprised herself by telling him the whole of it, start to finish. Something she had not planned to do, but it came easily once she started. The way confession sometimes does when the person across the table has spent 40 years learning how to simply listen. Pastor Cray was quiet for a long moment after she finished, turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. "I buried Curtis Boyd," he said finally. 1983. I was young then, my first year at this church, and it was the hardest funeral I'd done up to that point. I remember Odessa Boyd sitting in the front pew. I remember a young man near the back, alone, who left before the reception and never came inside for the meal. After, was that Walter? I always believed it was, Pastor Cray said. I never knew his name back then. Just a young man who looked like the weight of the whole church roof was sitting on his shoulders and left before anyone could ask him to set it down. I thought about him for years afterward, wondered what became of him. I had no idea all this time he'd been sitting 3 pews back from me every single Sunday since. He never told you either. Men like Walter don't confess to preachers, Pastor Cray said. Not unkindly. They confess to ledgers and to God, in that order, and they let the two of us sort out the paperwork between us in our own time. I think that's a kind of faith too, Nora, even if it doesn't look like the kind we preach on Sunday mornings. A man who pays a debt for 41 years without once asking to be absolved of it, that's not a man who doesn't believe in grace. That's a man who believes grace has to be earned back one Tuesday at a time, and never quite trusts he's earned enough of it yet. Do you think he was wrong to believe that? Pastor Cray considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think grace was always his the moment he filed those maintenance requests and got ignored, he said. But I also think a man's allowed to carry his own penance in whatever shape helps him sleep at night, so long as it doesn't poison the people around him. And from what you're telling me, Nora, it never did. He showed up for this family every single day. He just also showed up quietly. For another family nobody here ever knew he owed anything to. I don't call that a flaw in the man. I call that the fullest measure of him. Nora sat with that a long while after Pastor Cray left, the foil dish cooling untouched on the counter. She found his words settled something in her that had been sitting unsettled since the day she'd first opened the ammunition box. Wendell came by Sunday morning before the children arrived. Early, before the light had fully cleared the ridge. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, the way men of his generation still did when they meant to say something that mattered. "Wanted to see you before Ellis and Faye got here," he said. "Case you needed a steady voice in the room, or case you just needed somebody who already knows the whole of it, so you're not carrying today alone." "I'd like that," Nora said. "Would you stay?" "Not to speak for me. Just to be there, the way you were in the workshop that first day." "I can do that," Wendell said, and settled into a chair at the far end of the kitchen. Not at the table itself, near enough to matter and far enough to leave the family its privacy. The particular calibration of a man who had spent his whole life understanding exactly how much space a friend should take up in someone else's hardest morning. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of West Virginia autumn day Walter had always loved best. Sharp blue sky, the smell of wood smoke drifting from somewhere down the road. Nora set the kitchen table the way she had for 42 years of Sunday dinners. Though today there was no dinner. Only the ledgers stacked at the centre of the table, where a roast might once have sat. The letter addressed to Edie beside them. The parcel deed, the inquest file, and the settlement letter, from 1984, arranged in the order she intended to present them. Ellis arrived first, alone, Dawn staying home this time, at Nora's request. A request Ellis had accepted without argument, which told Nora something about how unsettled the surveyor's call had left him. Faye arrived 20 minutes later, having stayed the weekend at a motel in town, rather than drive back and forth to Charleston twice. They sat where they had always sat, Ellis at his father's old place at the head of the table, Faye across from her brother, Nora at the foot, the ledgers between them like a fourth guest nobody had yet been introduced to. "Before either of you say anything," Nora began, "I want you to understand that what I'm about to show you isn't about the money. Not at first and not really, even at the end. It's about your father, and it's about a night in 1983, before either of you were born, that I think shaped the rest of his life more than anything else that ever happened to him. I need you to listen to the whole of it before you start doing arithmetic in your heads, Ellis. Can you do that for me?" Ellis, to his credit, nodded. Some of the usual certainty gone from his face, replaced by something that looked, for the first time in weeks, like real uncertainty. "Then let me start at the beginning," Nora said, and opened the first ledger to its first page, dated March of 1984. The month she had married a man she was only now, 11 weeks after burying him, beginning to fully know. She told it slowly, the way Wendell had suggested, letting the ledger carry the weight of it rather than her own voice. She read the first entry aloud. $150. CB cash. Paid in full for the month. She told them about the accident, about Curtis Boyd, 22 years old, about the safety log, with Walter's name on 3 ignored maintenance requests, and a plant manager named Roy Dunmore who had let them sit on a desk until a young man died because of it. Ellis sat very still through all of it. The stillness of a man who has built his whole adult life on being the one who understands the numbers first, and has just discovered a column he never knew existed. He was never charged with anything, Nora said. The county cleared him completely, but he paid every month anyway, for 41 years, because he never once let himself believe blameless was the same thing as clean. She read them the letter next, the one addressed to Edie, her voice steady until she reached the line about her mother's name, folded into her own. There she had to stop for a moment. Faye reached over and took her hand. Ellis, across the table, looked down at his own hands, as though he did not entirely recognize them. "He called you Edie," Ellis said quietly when she finished. "I never once heard him call you that." "Neither had I," Nora said. "I think, near the end, grief and love got tangled up in him in ways even he couldn't fully separate anymore. I've made my peace with it. I hope you both can too." She told them about the bank box, about Curtis Amble and the sole access account, about the inquest file Sheila Voss had pulled from the courthouse archive. Last, because she had saved it for last on purpose, she told them about the parcel deed, about Sheila's final phone call the day before, about the county's Riverwalk project, the corridor study, and the land now sitting quiet and unassuming, directly in the path of a redevelopment vote, a vote that stood to make it worth many times what anyone in this family had imagined. The same land Ellis had called, 3 days after his father's funeral. Not worth the dumpster to haul it off. The silence after she finished lasted a long time. How much? Ellis said finally. Nora watched Faye wince a little at the question, though it was, Nora had to admit, the most human question in the room, even if it was also the smallest one. The payments alone came to just over $190,000 over 41 years, Nora said. The parcel's value, once the county project moves forward, Sheila estimates conservatively in the range of $400,000, possibly more, depending on how the easement negotiation goes. All of it, every dollar, is in my name alone. Your father made sure of that very deliberately, a long time before either of you had any idea any of this existed. Ellis's jaw worked for a moment. Nora watched her son do something she had not seen him do in a long time. Struggle visibly, to find the right words instead of reaching immediately for the confident ones. "Why didn't he tell me?" he said finally. His voice cracked on the last word, in a way that surprised all three of them. "I sat in this kitchen and told you the workshop wasn't worth the dumpster to haul it off. I said that to your face, Mum, 3 days after we buried him. And the whole time he'd built, $500,000 back there, and I was standing in the doorway calling it junk." "You didn't know," Nora said gently. "Neither did I." "But why didn't he tell me?" Alice pressed. Real hurt in it now. Not the careful calm he'd carried through every conversation since the funeral. Something rawer underneath it, that Nora hadn't expected to see and found, despite everything, that she was glad to see. "I'm his son. I would have understood. I would have helped him carry it." Nora thought about that for a long moment before she answered, choosing her words the way she'd learned, this past strange month, to choose them carefully, the way Walter always had. "I've asked myself the same question about why he didn't tell me," she said. "I don't have a full answer, Ellis, but I think your father carried shame the way some men carry a limp. Quietly, adjusting his whole gait around it so nobody else would notice the weight. I don't think it was about trust. Not really. Not in the way it feels right now. I think he genuinely believed the kindest thing he could do for the people he loved was carry it alone, and let us all remember him as simply solid instead of complicated." "That's not kindness," Ellis said. "That's just being alone with it. That's not the same thing." "No," Nora agreed. "It isn't. And I think, if I'm honest, some part of me is still working through being a little angry about that myself. But I'd rather be angry at a man who loved us too carefully than one who didn't love us at all, Ellis. I think that's the choice in front of both of us right now." Ellis was quiet a long moment, looking down at the ledger open in front of him, at his father's small, careful handwriting stretching across 4 decades of a debt nobody made him pay. "I called it junk," he said finally, very quiet. "I stood in that doorway and told you it wasn't worth hauling off, and the whole time it was, 40 years of him doing the one decent thing none of us ever knew needed doing." "You didn't know," Faye said, echoing her mother. She reached across the table to touch her brother's arm. A gesture Nora hadn't seen pass between her children in longer than she could remember. "I should have asked," Ellis said, "instead of assuming. I've been assuming things about this whole estate since the day we buried him, and I haven't once stopped to ask what any of it actually meant to him. That's on me, not on Dad." Nora watched her son sit with that, watched something shift behind his eyes that she recognised distantly as the boy he had been before the world taught him that confidence and speed were the same thing as competence. She reached into her coat pocket, where she had carried it every day for 2 weeks now, and drew out the folded crayon drawing she had found in the workshop. She set it on the table in front of him without a word. Ellis unfolded it slowly. Ellis, age 7. A crooked little house with a crooked little son in the corner. The kind of drawing every child makes and every parent is supposed to eventually lose in the shuffle of moving boxes and passing years. "He kept this," Ellis said, and his voice broke fully this time. "In there. This whole time." "Behind a jar of screws," Nora said, "close enough to touch. Every single day he worked in that shed for 40 years. Nobody spoke for a while after that." Ellis held the drawing with both hands, careful. The way you hold something you suddenly understand, you very nearly lost the chance to ever see. "What do you want to do?" he said finally, looking up at his mother. "About all of it. The house, the parcel, the listing. I'll call the realtor off today if that's what you want. I should have called her off weeks ago. I'd like to keep the house for now. Nora said. I'm not ready to leave it, and I don't think I need to be rushed into deciding that by a market timeline. The parcel stays mine, as your father intended, though I want you both to know I have no intention of hoarding whatever it becomes. If the county's project moves forward, and that land is worth what Sheila thinks it's worth, I'll see it split fairly, between the two of you, and set some aside for Regina Boyd Tillman's family as well, because I think your father would have wanted that, even if he never said so in so many words. Who's Regina Boyd Tillman? Ellis asked. Curtis Boyd's sister, Nora said. I spoke with her last week. I think when you're both ready, it might do this family some good to meet her properly. Not out of obligation, out of the kind of loyalty your father spent 41 years demonstrating without ever once asking anybody to notice. Ellis nodded slowly. He looked down at the ledger again, then at the crayon drawing still in his hands. Something in his face settled into a kind of quiet Nora had not seen in him since he was much younger, since before ambition had smoothed all his rougher, more honest edges into something efficient and a little cold. Faye had been quiet through most of this, letting her brother work through it in his own time. Now she spoke, careful, the way she always weighed a thing before she said it out loud. Mom, I don't want a fair split if it means you go without. You've spent your whole life making sure Ellis and I had more than we needed. I'd rather see it go toward the house staying comfortable for you, or toward whatever Regina's family could use, before it ever touches my account. I appreciate that, Nora said, but your father built this so all of us would be provided for, not so I'd carry the whole of it alone, while you two stood back out of guilt. I don't intend to let either of you turn generosity into another way of managing me. That drew a small, surprised laugh out of Ellis, the first real laugh Nora had heard from her son since the funeral. That's fair, he said. That's very fair, actually. I think I've been trying to manage this whole estate since the day we buried him, and I'm starting to understand that was never really my job to begin with. It was never anybody's job but your father's, Nora said, and now, I suppose, a little bit mine. But I don't intend to do it alone either, not entirely. I'd like the two of you involved, when the time comes, in deciding how the trust for Regina's family gets structured. Your father never had anyone to help him carry it. I don't see any reason his children shouldn't help me carry it forward if you're both willing. I'm willing, Faye said immediately. Ellis nodded a beat behind her, slower, but no less certain. Faye's words settled something else in the room too, and it stayed quiet a moment before Ellis spoke again. I want to see the workshop, Ellis said. Properly. Not to measure it for a listing. I just want to see where he kept all of this. I'd like that, Nora said, and meant it more than she'd expected to. They walked out together after that, the three of them, down the gravel path to the little building at the end of Hollow Creek Road that Ellis had once called worthless in front of his own grieving mother. Nora unlocked the padlock one more time. She pulled the string on the single bulb. She stood back to let her children see, for the first time in their lives, the whole quiet architecture of their father's 41 years of keeping his word. Monday morning, Ellis called the realtor himself and withdrew the listing agreement before Nora had even finished her coffee. She only learned about it afterward, when he phoned to tell her it was done. He asked, a little sheepishly, whether she wanted him to help fix the workshop roof instead, since he'd noticed, walking through it Sunday, that the flashing along one edge had started to lift. Your father would have fixed that himself inside a week, Nora said, but I'd welcome the help, Ellis. I think he'd have liked that too. Sheila Voss called again on Wednesday. The county's corroborating file, the inquest report, and the maintenance log naming Roy Dunmore's failure to act had been formally entered into the estate record at Nora's request, not to punish anyone so long dead or retired from public memory, simply so the truth of it existed somewhere official, permanent, no longer dependent on a locked shed and a careful man's private discipline to survive him. Some families bury the whole thing back down with the man who carried it, Sheila said. You didn't. That matters more than people think, Mrs. Pruitt. The county's Riverwalk project cleared its final procedural vote 3 weeks later. The parcel negotiation opened not long after, handled by a fair, unhurried attorney Nora hired on Wendell's recommendation. A woman who had once represented the Mill Workers' Union, back when Hartsell Lumber still employed half the county. Nora was told privately that she negotiated the easement with a great deal more patience than the county's first offer had suggested. A great deal less appetite for lowballing an old widow too. Nora used part of the settlement, once it closed, to finish the last of what Walter had started. Not because anyone required it of her, not because Regina Boyd Tillman had ever once asked for a single additional dollar. She simply sat down one evening at the kitchen table, opened the fourth ledger she had bought herself, blank, waiting, and wrote a first entry in her own hand, careful and small, the way her husband had taught her without ever once meaning to teach her anything at all. $5,000. RBT Trust, established this date, in memory of CB and WP both. She mailed the paperwork herself on a Tuesday, the way Walter always had. By then it had stopped feeling like his ritual alone. It started feeling like something she was allowed to carry forward in her own name. Regina came to visit in November, driving the 2 hours from Charleston with her husband and her 2 teenage children. She stood in the workshop doorway a long while before she said anything at all, looking at the workbench, the pegboard, the calendar still turned to the month Walter died. "He never met me," she said finally. 41 years, and he never once tried to meet me. "I think he was afraid to," Nora said. "I think, in his mind, meeting you would have meant asking to be forgiven, and he never once believed he'd earned that." "He didn't need to earn it," Regina said quiet. "My mother forgave him the day the first envelope arrived, back when I was too young to understand what it meant. She used to say there's guilty men who pay to make the guilt go away, and there's guilty men who pay because paying is the only language decency has left to speak once an apology isn't enough. She always said your husband was the second kind." Nora thought that was perhaps the truest thing anyone had said about Walter since she'd buried him. She told Regina so. The two women stood together a while longer in the cold, clean light of that single bulb. Two widows of a sort, bound by a debt that had outlived the man who'd started paying it. Regina's teenage son, quiet through most of the visit, finally spoke up as they were getting ready to leave. He stood by the workbench with his hands in his pockets, the careful way boys that age stand when they are working up courage to say something sincere. "Is it okay if I come back sometime?" he asked, "and just, I don't know, learn to use some of these tools? My mum says he was good with his hands. I never got to know a grandfather like that." Nora looked at the boy a long moment, something in his face reminding her, unexpectedly, of Ellis at that same age, before ambition had smoothed him into somebody else. "I'd like that very much," she said. "I think Walter would have liked that more than almost anything I could offer you." Ellis and Dawn came to dinner the following Sunday, the first Sunday dinner Nora had cooked since the funeral. Ellis brought the crayon drawing framed now, small and simple, and hung it himself on the workshop wall before they ate, driving the nail in carefully, the way his father had once taught him to drive a nail when Ellis was still young enough to want to learn. "I've been thinking," Ellis said over dinner, in a voice quieter than Nora had heard from him in years, "about what Dad carried all that time. I keep trying to imagine what it would have taken to hold something like that for 41 years and never once let it show at a birthday party, or a graduation, or any of the 1,000 ordinary days he showed up for us instead of falling apart." "He never fell apart," Nora agreed. "Not once, not that I ever saw. I used to think that meant there was nothing underneath to fall apart about. I understand now it meant something almost the opposite. There was a great deal underneath. He just never let it become our burden to carry." "I don't want to be like that," Ellis said, surprising her. "I don't want my kids to bury me someday and find out there was a whole second version of me they never got to know. If something's wrong, I want to say it out loud, even if it costs me something to say it." "That's not nothing to learn, Ellis," Nora said. "That might be the whole of what your father would have wanted you to take from all of this, if you'd asked him, which I don't think he ever expected any of us to." Faye, who had come down for the dinner too, sat quiet for a moment, then set her fork down. "I've been thinking about something similar," she said, "about how easy it is to assume you know somebody just because you love them. I thought I knew Dad completely. I didn't know a fraction of him. That scares me a little, if I'm honest. Makes me wonder what I don't know about the two of you either." "You'll know what we choose to show you," Nora said gently, "same as we all do with each other. That's not a flaw, Faye. That's just what it is to love somebody across a whole lifetime, year after year, season after season. You see what they let you see and you trust the rest was kind, even when you can't prove it yet." "I like that better than being scared of it," Faye said, and managed a small smile, the tightness in her shoulders easing for the first time all evening. Dawn had been quiet through most of dinner, listening. Now she reached over and squeezed Ellis's hand under the table, a small gesture Nora noticed and appreciated more than she let on. For what it's worth, Dawn said, I think you're already different than you were 3 months ago. Not perfect. Just different. I'll take different. Different's a start, Ellis said, and managed something close to a real smile. The first Nora had seen from him since long before the funeral. Faye visited most weekends after that, staying in her childhood bedroom. The three of them, mother, son, daughter, fell into a new rhythm around the old kitchen table. Nora found to her quiet surprise that she treasured it more than she had treasured the family's rhythm in the years before Walter died, when everyone had been too busy, too far apart, too certain there would always be more time later to really sit and talk. There had not been more time. There rarely is. But there had been, it turned out, more truth than any of them expected, waiting patiently behind a locked door for exactly the right hands to finally lift the right floorboard. Winter came to Piney Fork the way it always had, sharp and quick, off the ridge. On the first real snow of the season, Nora walked down to the workshop alone in the early morning, the way she used to walk down with a thermos of coffee for a man who could never quite explain why the door had to stay locked. She unlocked it now without hesitation, the padlock's mechanism familiar to her hands after months of use. She stepped inside. She pulled the string on the bulb. She stood a moment looking at the space Ellis had helped her clear and organise over the past several weeks. The ledger sat on a shelf now, upright, in order, no longer hidden beneath a floorboard, but simply kept, the way you keep anything that has earned the right to be seen. The framed crayon house hung on the wall beside a small photograph Faye had found and had copied. Walter, at 19, his first year at the mill, grinning at a camera the way young men grin before the world has asked anything hard of them yet. She swept the workbench clean, the way she had every week since November. She set the coffee mug, hers chipped at the handle, back in its place on the shelf. Not because anyone was coming to fill it, because some habits she had decided deserved to outlive their original reason and become something new instead. A remembering, rather than a waiting. Regina's son had come out twice more since November, learning to sand and to true a board along the old workbench vise. Wendell had taken to stopping by most Saturdays to teach him properly, the two of them filling the little room with sawdust and quiet instruction, the way Walter once had, alone, for 40 years. Ellis had fixed the roof flashing himself, one cold weekend in December, and had not once mentioned square footage while he did it. Faye kept a second ledger going now, in her own careful hand, tracking every dollar of the trust as it moved toward Regina's family. Checked twice before she trusted the sum, the way her mother had taught her, without either of them ever calling it a lesson. Even Dawn had started coming out on Saturdays now, not to measure anything, just to sit on the overturned bucket with a cup of coffee and watch the boy learn to true a board. She said once quietly that she'd never expected a locked shed to teach her more about her own husband's family than a decade of holidays ever had. She stood in the doorway a long moment before leaving, breath showing pale in the cold. She looked back at the small, humble room. 40 years of devotion had lived there, more than she had ever known to look for. It was never junk, she said quietly. It was 40 years of him keeping his word. Then she pulled the string, and the bulb went dark and she stepped out into the pale morning light.